the economics of carbon fee and dividend policies, you have come to the right place and you can stay for the right party. This is Core Volunteer Training, which is a program created to help our supporters, like you, especially newer volunteers, connect with each other around the larger world and empower you to achieve your larger goals for climate advocacy. This week's key topic is, as I said, the economics of carbon fee and dividend policies. I am your host, Tamara Staten. I am CCL's Volunteer Education and Engagement Assistant. Thank you so much for joining us. If you want to follow along with our slides tonight, you can get those slides at cclusa.org/economics-CVT. We have 3 learning goals for you this evening. After tonight's lesson, attendees should be able to, number 1, understand the rationale for the 3 legs of CCL's flagship policy, which is called, you guessed it, carbon fee and dividend. Number 2, describe each of the legs in your own words and how it would function in our country. And number 3, address economic issues related to each leg, often raised by others with questions. It is my honor to introduce our speaker for this evening, Bob Archer. Bob is an economist by training with a BA from Yale and a master's from the University of Pittsburgh. He is a former Peace Corps volunteer and worked on energy reforms, regulatory development, and energy efficiency in Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, South and Southeast Asia with the USAID, Agency for International Development. He comes to us tonight with over 30 years of experience working on economic policy for the national and Washington, D.C. interests. He now spends his time generously volunteering for CCL and serves on the steering committee of the Marin, California chapter and is the leader of the CCL Economic Policy Network action team. Before I pass it over to him, let me just tell you briefly about our agenda this evening. It's pretty straightforward. After a short introduction about the general public perception about carbon taxes, Bob will give you the why, or the rationale, for each element of CCL's 3-part policy, including how it works, why it's important, and naturally the economic issues, which are often brought up by Congress. And with that, I will pass it to you, Bob.
All right, thank you. Good evening, everyone. I want to lead off with 2 slides to provide context. The first, that the challenge is global. And this is a statement by Nobel economist William Nordhaus. There are billions of individuals, millions of firms, thousands of governments, hundreds of nations, and for them to take action, they're going to have incentives. We can raise the price of goods and services that are carbon intensive. The policies the U.S. puts in place must be workable in developing countries where most climate emissions are occurring. The second slide shows people's concerns about a carbon tax. A synthesis of 26 studies was done to identify how to make carbon taxes more acceptable. It showed 4 main concerns that people have. You can see these. Personal costs are too high, negative impacts on low-income households, mistrust of government, and it's not effective in discouraging the high carbon behavior. Now, the beauty of the CCL policy is that the first 3 are addressed directly by the equitable dividend. The study found that number 4, the lack of understanding that the carbon fee reduced emissions leads people to favor spending revenues on clean energy projects instead of a carbon dividend, which hurts the low and middle income households. The good news is that when people understand that the fee reduces emissions, the dividend becomes the preference over clean energy expenditures. So we in CCL need to communicate that the carbon fee is effective and the revenues should protect low and middle income households. So let's start with the basic economics underpinning the fee in the CCL policy. Simply put, why do we need a fee? You need to raise the price of fossil fuels and the demand goes down and emissions go down. The connection is not sufficiently understood or accepted. Our climate problem is due to a major market failure resulting in negative external costs. When a factory dumps its pollution, such as CO2 in the air and water, the costs fall on us and not on the factory. So there's no incentive for the polluter to change. And here's where the polluter pay principle applies. CCL's carbon fee puts the cost back on the cost of pollution, fossil fuels. Now, to date, as you're probably aware, our focus has been on the power of the fee to reduce emissions. There's a second and important impact, the power to accelerate clean energy innovation, hence the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. There's a point of view, however, that research and development is all we need, okay? We don't need a carbon fee. Frankly, such a view ignores the history of oil and gas, where research and development innovation has continued to lead to declining costs. However, a widely held view among academics, industry, and innovators is that the carbon fee will accelerate innovation and speed market adoption by providing strong incentives and by making fossil fuels more expensive. And this is Nobel economist Paul Romer's view. And then CCL's policy basically reflects his approach and recommendation: start low and escalate the fee. As you probably know, the fee starts at $15 a ton of CO2 and rises $10 each year, or $15 if the emissions target aren't met. Most other proposals introduced in Congress start higher and escalate slower. Take note that this fee over a decade will produce about $2.5 trillion to $3 trillion. So we'll talk about the use of those revenues in a few minutes. The issue of why a rising fee is an important one. Any carbon pricing policy won't do. And the great power, I think, of CCL's policy is the predictable rising price. It sends a powerful economic-wide signal for investment and innovation, unlike regulation or cap and trade, which have not provided the trajectory, predictability, or environmental certainty as academic theory contends. You need to start low and escalate. This avoids the economic shock and early political backlash. This is the approach that the British Columbia and Canada. It started low and a steady, predictable increase. It allows planning and economic adjustment by industry, utilities, and households. It provides a clear long-term signal to get the largest household behavior response. And this is an important one. It's called tax salience. Tax salience is a field of economic research that shows that people are more likely to change their behavior in response to a highly visible, highly salient tax increase compared to what happens with traditional energy market swings and prices like gasoline, up and down, but not much real change. So there are many more reasons for a carbon fee versus cap and trade or regulation. Simplicity, transparency, efficiency. I think I saw that in some of your comments. Effectiveness, administrative, and something that I think is very important is it a good fit for developing countries with weak institutions and corruption and income inequality. Sometimes you get that we're just trying to hide a tax. A fee is really a tax, but a fee is an appropriate term. It's commonly used for environmental programs that assign cost to pollution activities. For example, garbage in the street, there's a fee imposed for picking it up. But I like the reason it came from George Shultz, who was Ronald Reagan's Secretary of State, and he's also a CCL advisory board member, who he told CCL, it's not a tax if the government doesn't keep the money. Let's shift to the administration issue. The carbon fee and dividend can basically use existing IRS and Treasury Department procedures in those institutions and avoid the creation of new bureaucracies, minimize the risk of abuse and corruption. It is applied upstream, as close as possible to the mine, the well, and port of importation. For coal, the fee could be imposed at the mine or approximately 500 coal preparation plants. There's actually a form, IRS 720. It has a line on it for excise tax for coal. It's simply a matter of adding another carbon fee for coal. All those are calculated at the mine. For oil and gas, the fee can be placed at approximately 140 refineries and some 500 natural gas processing plants. So the bottom line is, this is manageable. The fee impact on emissions is significant. The Stanford Energy Modeling Forum forecast reductions of 26 to 47% by 2030, exceeding Paris and former Clean Power Plan targets. And the REMI study was done previously to match that. U.S. service industries, retail, healthcare, and the like, are shown to benefit the most. But it's important to note, and a grain of salt with modeling, it doesn't come close to capturing all the benefits, the co-benefits, like local pollution reduction, health benefits, or accelerated innovation. So beware of models. Now, household energy costs will rise about 5 to 10% with initial $15 a ton. This will stimulate awareness and initiation of change behavior without economic shock and political backlash. Your average U.S. home energy bill is about $2,000 a year spread among heating, cooling, water heating appliances, etc., electronics. A 10% increase is about $200. The first year dividend will be approximately $750 for a family of four. So the rising costs will be more than covered, which answers a big challenge from a lot of people. Now, we've heard that narrative often that a carbon tax is a job and economy killer. Today, we've depended upon the climate economic modeling forecast to refute this. That's changed. Gilbert Metcalf is a Tufts University professor, and he's a new CCL advisory board member, a great addition, along with James Stack of Harvard. They published their research on the actual carbon tax impact in 31 European countries on economic growth and jobs, and the results are very encouraging. Carbon taxes have no negative effect on GDP growth rate or unemployment, and maybe a slightly positive in some cases. In other words, there's no basis for the view that carbon taxes kill growth or jobs. So, in summary, there are 5 main economic impact takeaways. First, the fee is effective. Second, innovation will take off. Third, health benefits, local pollution reductions, and other co-benefits not captured by the modeling will be significant. Fourth, the economy will continue to grow just fine. And fifth, the dividend is the most equitable policy. We're at a point in our discussions with other groups and individuals to talk about effective carbon fees. Now, here's a good example of the impact of a carbon fee. The United Kingdom imposed a carbon tax, what they called a carbon price floor, on coal and gas for power generation, which caused an 85% decline in coal use from 2014 to 2017. The UK imposed it on top of the European Union cap and trade program, which was stagnant at about $5 to $9 a ton of CO2 during the period 2012 to 17. Interestingly, the UK green organizations opposed it initially, saying it would never work. And they now advocate for maintaining this tax. Interesting political economy change. There are several significant misunderstandings about the fee and dividend policy, but I'll address just one. And that's the view that industry will pass on all the carbon fee to consumers and continue their business as usual, polluting. That's not the case. The fee really affects all. Industry, businesses, governments, utilities, consumers, some greatly and some less so. But billions of investment and consumption decisions are affected each day. Most industries have to absorb some of the rising energy input costs. Otherwise, they will lose customers. A recent study showed that selected industries pass on 25 to 75% of the fossil energy cost to consumers, depending upon the industry's competitive position, their market power, and the availability of consumer alternatives. In addition, industry also shifts some of the burden back up to fossil fuel companies, suppliers, by switching to clean energy options. Okay, move right into the dividend and see if this answers it. And then let's come back to that very question, which is use money for the dividend for low income or take it and use it for other purposes. So let's move to the second leg, the dividend or household dividend or carbon dividend, as it sometimes is called. Who gets the dividend and how much? You're probably familiar with this. It consists of a full share for up to 2 adults, half shares for children up to age 18. So a family of 4 we get about $2,000 a year in year 3, and over $3,000 a year in year 5, and approaching $4,000 a year in year 10. Everybody has a view on the use of large revenues. So why a household dividend? There are 2 big reasons. The dividend is the most equitable of all the policies and programs. Also, it brings long-term policy viability. People will like it and advocate for continuity of the fee. Very important, critical political economy issue. And it pumps money into the economy at the consumer level, benefiting small and medium-sized businesses. Now, it's important to note, as an economist, there is an economist statement consisting of 2,600 economists. They give priority to taking the revenues and giving it out in a dividend to households for the reasons of equity and sustainability. Instead of the traditional economist's approach, all this revenue comes in from a carbon tax, carbon fee. We're going to cut corporate taxes over here for efficiency purposes. So equity wins over efficiency for the 2,600 economists, which is a big shift for economists. As I said, the dividend is the most equitable use. Bottom 2/3 of households generally break even or come out ahead. That is, their dividend equals or exceeds the cost of rising fuel costs and products, which partly gets at the question you're raising. It actually disproportionately benefits low-income households, and that's based on the Treasury study and several other studies. So let's look at the alternative uses and their equity impacts. The option of using tax cuts to offset the revenue from the fee, payroll, personal tax cuts, corporate tax cuts, generally means the benefits disproportionately accrue to higher income households. So I'll discuss the use of revenues for clean energy programs at the end. Take a look at the political impact of Canada's dividend approach. This is very fresh. Canada's carbon tax policy has a dividend that is provided to households through a tax credit instead of a check. Remember the slide at the start that showed the 3 main concerns people have and how dividends address them? The concerns are personal costs, impact on low-income households, and the belief that the government wants to keep the money. All 3 of these concerns are met by Canada's policy and implementation. Canada started a carbon tax at $20 a ton Canadian money, deduct 10% for US, in April of 2019, designed to increase $10 a ton to $50 a ton by 2022. That is impressive. At the start of the carbon tax year, April 1st, they give the household tax credit at the same time as raising the carbon tax, just like HR 763, the bill we support, puts the dividend at the start. Most households come out ahead, lower income. Canada's experience validates the dividend concept. The policy was vindicated in the 2019 federal election, despite strong conservative opposition. And second, the tax predictability and continuity was maintained in the face of the coronavirus economic crash in April of this year. Prime Minister Trudeau was quoted as saying, "Our plan on pricing pollution puts more money up front into people's pockets than they would pay with a new price on pollution. We're going to continue to focus on putting more money in people's pockets to support them right across the country." In the middle of the pandemic, he was able to raise that carbon fee. So we get to the fun chart. How is the dividend administered? So don't try to read this. Basically, it's fairly simple. You propose to use existing tax procedures, plus a new form for those who don't submit tax forms. In fact, this $1,200 CARES Act payment that's gone out is a dry run for the Treasury Department to figure out how to disperse such checks and verify who gets the money. Okay, let's go to the third leg, the border carbon adjustment. This is a must-have feature to succeed on a global basis, and maybe the least discussed, but it's getting a lot more discussion. And the Europeans are starting to consider this. Now, what is it, a border carbon adjustment? It's two things. It's a tariff, which is basically a tax, that's placed on goods imported from or rebate on goods that we export to countries without an equivalent price on carbon. So the tariff and rebate are based on the carbon content of the goods imported and exported. The term duties, tariffs, and levies are often used interchangeably. Let's use Brazil as an example. So assume the US has a carbon price and Brazil doesn't. That'll be the day. The adjustment has two parts. So when some goods are imported from Brazil, where there's no carbon price, a tariff is put on those goods. And when a US company exports to Brazil, it gets a rebate based upon the carbon content of that product. Think about it, and a Brazilian firm doesn't have to pay a carbon fee and has an unfair advantage over a US competitor. It can export to the US and undercut the US firm that has higher costs due to the fee. So we put that tariff on that Brazilian import to level the playing field. And when a US company tries to export to Brazil, it won't be competitive. So a rebate is paid to the US company based on the carbon content of the exported product. If Brazil establishes its own comparable carbon fee to what the US has, then there will be no carbon duties or rebates either way. As previously mentioned, the household dividend addresses the fairness issue for households. The border carbon adjustment addresses the fairness issue for industry. It's critical to avoid adverse industry impacts that could come from countries without a carbon fee. So CCL's talking point on this is it removes any incentive for US industries to move to countries without a comparable carbon price. It avoids exporting pollution, or in economic terms, it avoids leakage. Industries use a lot of energy and face international competition. And those using a lot are likely to be at risk from trade competition. There's a term for industries that use a lot of fossil energy. A lot is defined as 5% or more of production costs. And industries that are exposed to trade competition, and that means 15% or more of their product is exported and faces foreign competition. This term is called energy intensive trade exposed, EITE, not the most slick acronym. Generally, there's not much industry harm at low carbon prices, $10 to $15 a ton. I'll give you an example of a real world impact of a rising carbon price and no border adjustment. British Columbia greenhouses, flowers and vegetables, okay? They suffered competitively at $24 a ton in 2012 because California and Mexico greenhouses didn't have to pay a carbon tax on their energy use. So they got an exemption. Keep in mind, this is a Canadian province that cannot impose a border carbon adjustment, which can only be done at the national level. So which industries are most exposed? Less than 10% of industries fall into this EITE, energy intensive trade exposed category. Most industries' energy costs average about 2% of production costs. So that's not that big for lots of industries. Now, a $25 a ton carbon tax would increase production costs in electric utilities about 20%. Cement and petrochemicals about 10%, aluminum, iron, steel, lime, gypsum, fertilizer, paper, and the like about 5%. That gives you a feel for enough of a signal for them to start making changes. Here we are again on the administration of this, another advantage of the CCL approach. Existing institutions administer this, the Department of Commerce, International Trade Administration, Customs and Border Protection. And funds collected are separate from the carbon fee, and they cover administrative costs. In fact, the US imports more goods than it exports. So there would be a buildup of money over time. The legality issue comes up sometimes. There is US legal precedent for border carbon adjustment, basically the 1990 Montreal Protocol. And there are two General Agreement on Tariff and Trade articles, GATT, that relate to this, but I'm going to skip those and get to Article 20. This allows discriminatory practice for environmental reasons in this General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, administered by the World Trade Organization. And you can see what those are: necessary to protect human and animal life, and relate to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources. These two terms are in the preamble of the Energy Innovation and Conservation Act. CCL is working toward a national carbon fee, but climate change is global. So the US policy must be one that addresses this free rider problem. Those that don't have countries without a carbon fee in their industries are sneaking in with cheap products with no fee. That incentivizes countries to participate and is a good fit for developing countries with weak institutions, corruption, and income inequality. So CCL's policy meets those three requirements. How do you get to a global agreement? And we're going to be hearing more about this. And maybe the most pragmatic and promising path to harmonizing global pricing is a multilateral carbon pricing agreement among a subset of nations. Call it a club. This is the concept of Nobel economist William Nordhaus. The club would have a border carbon adjustment that incentivizes others to join. For example, the US, Canada, Europe, China, and India could start a club with a border carbon adjustment that would incentivize others to join. Now, the Paris Agreement is based upon ambition, has no enforcement, and is unlikely to achieve the necessary reductions. It's significant that the European Union is planning on starting a border carbon adjustment in 2023. Ideally, it will be multilateral negotiations and discussions with the US and Canada and maybe others, so that it is done in a harmonious way and not in a way that is perceived as trade predation. So in summary, fee will raise the price, reduce demand and emissions, and a steady price allows for adjustment. And the revenue use, back to the people's most equitable. And dividend protects households and builds constituency support. And other options would be more expensive. And as we just discussed, the border carbon adjustment addresses unfair competition, encourages free rider countries to adopt the fee, and incentivizes global carbon pricing. Now, before we go to questions, I just want to touch briefly on regulations and subsidies. You're likely aware of the House Select Committee report on the climate crisis that was recently published. It gave priority to policies involving subsidies, regulations, and standards over the 12 pillars, 547 pages, and hundreds of recommendations. It gave little attention or priority to carbon pricing. Many of the proposed programs in that have 20 to 40 years of experience. So let's take a look briefly at some of the documented experience of subsidies and regulations. CCL volunteers will increasingly be asked, why not regulations and subsidies? And experience shows the following. Subsidies have been inequitable. That's based upon the University of California, Berkeley analysis of millions of tax returns and tax subsidies that were used. Regulations cost more and are less effective, as described in a recent International Monetary Fund analysis titled How to Mitigate Climate Change. Now, we'll get here to this issue of how about using the carbon-free revenues for clean energy subsidies, et cetera, such as clunker buying and the like. There are organizations that advocate that. As a Sierra Club member, they recommend all the revenues be used for clean energy programs, but don't really address how the inequity of impact on lower income households would be addressed. Using the revenues from the carbon-free for clean energy subsidies has two equity downsides. First, the households don't get the dividend and have to pay higher prices. And second, clean energy subsidies, based on the experience, go disproportionately to higher income households. Only 10% of the benefits went to the bottom 60% of households. The upper 20% received 60% of the benefits. And the most inequitable tax credits were for electric vehicles, where the upper 20% got 90% of the subsidies. And the IMF study showed that the two approaches, regulation and combined with cap and trade, are more costly and achieve less emission reductions. So in summary, the central message is that the fee and dividend is the foundational policy that is primary, essential, and economy-wide. Truly complementary regulation and subsidies can augment that carbon fee. Some experts suggest the following guidelines for determining when subsidies and regulations are justified. First, when a carbon fee does not impact a sector emissions at all. Enteric fermentation, cow burps, soil carbon sequestration. Second, where the fee does not impact a sector sufficiently, such as rental housing, where there are landlord-tenant incentive misalignments. In that case, complementary regulation like building codes and LIHEAP, low-income energy efficiency programs are justified. So that is a discussion that is going to be coming forward.
I just wanted to first of all say thank you to you for being here. If you have to go right now, go ahead. Of course, thanks for your attention and your interest. If you do have any questions, you can pose those on the forums at community.citizensclimate.org/forums. You can also visit the Economics Policy Network, and the address is on your screen. If you have any questions for Bob, you can email him at archer.robert2@gmail.com. Thank you for being here. Thanks for hanging out for so long talking about economics, especially you, Bob, for preparing us this talk this evening. Have a good night. Bye, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration. And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.